Hey everyone, my name is Caleb. I'm a student of Folklore and Game Design at New York University's Gallatin School. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about the Rakshasa and Western tabletop games. So to start, before we get going, I want to just do a quick experiment. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Rakshasa. Okay, good few people. Now I want you to keep your hands up for a second. Keep your hands up if your image of the Rakshasa is more or less this. So head of the tiger, other feline, maybe its hands are backwards. Okay, so a couple of people, which is a little bit interesting because that's a Rakshasa. And you notice looking at that, that doesn't look a whole lot like the one on the previous slide. Here's some other images of the Rakshasa. And this is, really quite different. And you wouldn't be really surprised if your image was on that first slide. Because if you Google Rakshasa, these are your image results. As you notice, I've highlighted here all the ones that match the first version. And it has started to get to the point where this is the image that comes up. And so, how did this happen? Dungeons and Dragons. But, actually, how did this happen? Because if we want to understand what it is that's happening here, we should go through and figure out how it happened. So this starts with, in 1975, when Gary Gygax watched an episode of The Night Stalker, which is a Monster of the Week show that at one point included a Rakshasa. He then turned around and he wrote a version of the Rakshasa for the Strategic Review, which is an early magazine that covers tabletop games, and he wrote it for a segment called Creature Features. And this is the first version of the Rakshasa that appears in tabletop game rules, and you'll notice a couple of things about it. You'll notice it specifies it's from India. That's a little bit uncommon. You'll also notice that it doesn't reference the tiger at all. It does not reference backwards hands. It's a shapeshifter, which is endemic to the original, but it does not have a lot of the features that from the version I showed you at the beginning. Then we get to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and now it's starting to look a little bit more like that. The text is almost the same, only minor additions. It's still minor revisions. It still specifically references India. It's been moved to lawful evil from chaotic. And this is the first time we see it as a tiger. We don't know why it was a tiger. This seems to have been artist's fiat. But this artist left to become a taxi driver in Chicago, so we don't know why. This then moves around. It enters into a couple of different games, and it takes a bunch of different forms. So in Adventures in Fantasy, it keeps a chaotic alignment, but it gives them colorful skin, no feline head. It also describes them as relatively stupid, something that goes against the relatively intelligent depiction from other versions. Same thing, Knights and Ledger Domain. This keeps the weakness for the blessed crossbow bolts, so blessed weapons, from the original. But again, it's not pushing the tiger version. And then we get to Dragon 84, which is the next big movement in this motif, which is very interesting for a variety of reasons. This attempts to take an academic look at the Rakshasa at this point, and it tries to evaluate whether or not it's authentic, which is a very interesting read. This is on the Internet Archive. I would recommend anyone interested in it take a look at it. But this is the first time that we see the backwards hands. This is where the backwards hands come in. And another major thing that this does that's going to be important later is this talks fluently. This talks both in the context of the original Hindu mythology. It talks about the story of Rama and the king of the Rakshasa. It also talks in the cosmology of D&D, describing what that might mean in Dungeons and Dragons. And then by second edition, most of those features had largely centered it, had largely been consolidated, And then by third edition, we get what I consider to be the holotype of this version of the Rakshasa. Right? The Rakshasa is a lawful evil monster, is connected to other planes, is the head of a tiger and backwards hands, and it uses its intelligence to oppress others for its own selfish aim. It can shapeshift, it can cast minor spells, it reads minds, and has immunity to weak magic, and has a weakness to blessed crossbow bolts. This is, I call it the holotype, because while there are modifications to it over time, 4th edition adds the idea of reincarnation, 5th edition makes them a fiend, Pathfinder expands what they can be, suggesting first that they be any kind of feline and then any kind of animal. But they are still noticeably referencing that original holotype. And there has been some conversation about this. Wizards of the Coast Magic the Gathering, for instance, made the decision to change this. Originally, in Khans of Tarkir, they released cat demons as the Rakshasa. But as part of their cultural sensitivity movements, they've removed that, and then with the release of these cards on Magic Arena, the digital platform, they've replaced the art. So the art is closer to something from the original motif, from the original mythology. But this has not been across the board. This is the 5.5e Dungeons & Dragons, and you can see just by looking at it that it has kept this general idea. And while it's moved towards softening it some, you can see by looking at it that even if it says it can have any physical quirk, that the picture has backwards hands. Even if it says its head can be anything, the picture is still a tiger. And so I've sort of gone through a couple of games here. But what does this mean? Actually, what meaning do we make of this? Well, first of all, games are folklore. And second of all, games participate in an Orientalist discourse. So let's go through these. First, games are folklore. When I say that games are folklore, anyone who has sort of a background in folklore might not necessarily be surprised by that. Folklore as a discipline has been progressively moving to include new forms of media and communication under its umbrella, basically since it was founded. Folklore is, at times it's been defined as broadly as artistic communication in small groups, which, if that sounds a bit like sitting at a role-playing table or even playing a game of cards, yeah. This puts games in the context of theories surrounding other folklore and media. Folklore in the traditional sense, in the oral sense, is individualized. It's one person to another person. It's also anonymous and collective. There is no person who has authorship over a given folklore motif, because by the time you are hearing it, it has gone through, presumably, many other people, to the point where the original influences are not necessarily traceable. Authored media, by contrast, and sort of the go-to here is literature, comes from a defined person or group of people. And you see this in games, where games come from a team of people. And you can, to some extent, trace the idea that you're reading in a game back to the people who are writing it. But games aren't quite like literature and movies, because games are played. Games are more interactive. And this brings us to something else in folklore, which is that folklore is performance. And I find something useful here in child lore. Don't read into that. In child lore, there's a construction that divides the spread of folklore between memorization, which is the spreading of ideas that come from outside the child's world, generally from parents or pop culture, and it spreads, and that combines with ad-libbing, right, improvisation. And that produces the form of folklore that's spread. And this, sounds quite a bit like playing a tabletop game. You have your rules, you have the game, and then you sit down to play, and you generate a novel context with the other people at your table. And this brings up another question of child lore, where in child lore, when a child hears an external source, they'll often adapt it to their own cosmology, which does sound an awful lot like what's happened in Dragon 84, which you can see they have describe something that has happened in the traditional Hindu mythology, and then they've described what that means for Dungeons and Dragons. They have adapted this mythology to their own cosmology. Which brings us to the second part of what I want to talk about, the somewhat more sinister part, which is games as Orientalism. So Orientalism, as we currently understand it, was defined by Edward Said in his book of the same name. He describes Orientalism as the body of knowledge about a region, the Orient, and that is built not on the lived reality of that region, but rather on other forms of information about that region that have already been circulated in the West. It is a method by which you can control another region by defining their reality in terms, not in terms of their lives, but in terms of your ideas. And folklore has always been a part of this. There is a great quote, all communities are imagined, but some communities are more imagined than others. And folklore has always been a method by which we define what a people are. This has been true going back to the Brothers Grimm, who were going out of their way to develop a German national identity and to invent a German people. To put this in something more of a game studies term, Orientalism is the difference between accuracy and authenticity. This is different, what that is to say, it's the difference between what you have to do to match a player's expectation and what you have to do to match the reality of the world we live in. Which is a definition that I thought was pretty clever until I realized that David Cook said almost exactly the same thing in his introduction to D&D's 1985 expansion, Oriental Adventures. In this book, notably, Gygax described the D&D monster manual as having basically a European flavor, which I think is a bit telling about how he is viewing these ideas. And a crucial fact about Orientalism is the fact that Orientalism is discursive. It's not just that there's a body of knowledge that is different from the lived reality, it's that new knowledge is progressively built on that disconnected body of knowledge. And it gets to the point where the original motif is choked out. And we've seen this with the Rakshasa, where each new edition of the Rakshasa is built not on the Hindu mythology that it's referencing, but on the versions that have already existed in tabletop games and in tabletop texts. And this has been slowly replacing the original motif. We saw that in the images. And this is part of a variety of problematic things about the Rakshasa. You notice the Rakshasa is a tiger. That's a symbol of British imperialism in India. You notice that the Rakshasa is greedy, that it's conniving, that it is just seeking to oppress other people for their own gain. All of these are reflective of British imperial anxieties over their colonized subjects in India. And these are all stereotypes that have existed for hundreds of years and that are being perpetuated by this iconography. And tabletop games are not alone in having done this. Games as a whole have been doing not great about the way that they've represented India and the subcontinent in general. And this has been true, and this is part of a broader problem in games. So, what does that mean for us as game designers? Well, first of all, check your sources. In 2025, you could probably staple this conclusion on to any talk about anything. But for here, I want to stress the fact that just because that even if you read something in a source that seems respectable, it's the information you're getting is only as good as the discourse that it's a part of. It's only as good as the foundation upon which it is built. And the second thing that the second major takeaway from this is that games are discursive. As you check through your game for the harm that it might do, you have to remember that even something that seems benign might not be, because it is not something that operates in a vacuum, it's something that operates in relation to other ideas in culture. Even if it might seem fine on its own, As you normalize and if you are normalizing and perpetuate harmful stereotypes and harmful ideas in the broader culture, then that is a source of harm, and that is something that needs to be controlled for in game design. Thank you. That ends short.
Any questions from the crowd?
I mean, I would just say that the first edition D&D manual, monster manual, was like so many different monsters or creatures not represented the way they are in folklore, like kobolds, or, you know, and I go on and on. But I feel like, I think the Rakshasa is a great case study, but it's really interesting how many changes to the folklore were introduced by Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons, it draws on a lot of changes that come from prior literature. The Rakshasa is interesting because it's endemic to the tabletop. This is where, Dungeons and Dragons is where this version of the motif comes from. It's not something that had been evolving prior that Gygax took from fantasy and brought in.
This evolution, etc. Why do you? It didn't really seem like with the source material that there was a discussion about why these like the evolution kept growing. So from like a game design and mechanic perspective, what do you think? Why were some of the reasons that this was done if it wasn't being done for like a deeper meaning or like?
It's being done because of the Orientalist discourse. Because as they're building each new version of D&D, they're looking back, and each new version of tabletop games too. This is something that does exist outside of D&D. D&D is just the biggest spreader. As they're looking back, the decision that they made was to design a version of the material that existed in prior editions. That was the decision. That's how we get here. Because the Rakshasa in later editions is a version of the earlier edition of D&D's Rakshasa, not a version of the Hindu myth. Yeah.
As we've seen with like more recent editions where we're removing like racial disads and things like that, why do you think that's not happening in this case, like to the Rakshasa? Why are we seeing that specific move away from a racialist or an Orientalist undertone in the same way that we're watching a downplay in the latest editions of that?
It's a very good question. We're seeing discrepancies on that even within the company, right? Wizards of the Coast owns both Magic the Gathering, which did decide this was a problem, and D&D, which didn't. I suspect the answer to that is awareness, because this is something that gets kind of taken for granted in some cases. You might not necessarily think about it. And it's easy to separate what's happening from the reality of the harm that it can do.
Yes. Kind of also build on that. What is the reason why this kind of keeps going? Is there something about the Rakshasa and the case study or others where like this has now become like an inherent element of the game? Where like I always use the Rakshasa as like a boss monster, for example, right? So is it because the game designers don't want to make the change now to like that and break away from this, or is it just because they're maybe to control intellectual property and they're seeing it from a business decision? What do you think is like, why hasn't this stopped for you?
Well, first thing I would sort of mention here is that they don't control the intellectual property for this design. There are individual Rakshasa that they can control their intellectual property for.
I always forget because like some of the monsters are and some of them aren't.
The iconography is not.
Okay.
Because the iconography has been spread and used by multiple different games in a way that sort of precludes individual ownership. As for the reason, the other part of the question was the reason why it hasn't changed. Is that right?
Yeah, like why hasn't it been stopped? Is it because they feel that they need to have a creature like this in the game?
Well, the longer this goes on, the more pressure there is to maintain the status quo, right? The more discourse you are a part that is backing up your decision, the more discourse that is behind you as you decide what you're adding to your game, the more that defines what does and does not feel normal in the game, which of course then extends out to what does and does not feel normal to you as media you can consume as an individual, which then extends on to how you perceive the world, right? So the longer this goes on, the harder, the more significant the change might feel, and the less push you might feel to make the change.
I mean, I agree with you realistically, right? Now this has been around for 40 years, right?
Yep.
Right. So then, is it now just too hard to change? I mean, obviously, Magic did it, right?
This is a decision, what I would say about this is it's a decision you would have to make actively.
Yeah.
It's not something that you would just passively stumble into changing at this point. You could change it. There's nothing physically stopping you from changing it, but you would have to make the decision to change it. Yes.
So one of the things that I find fascinating about this case study that you present is that this is a word drawn from folklore, and then the image changing repeatedly.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about if you take the traditional image of the Rakshasa, just change the name? Is that somehow different, or is that just a case of the same kind of orientalism?
Keep the image, but change the name.
The original. So instead of being a different portrayal in graphics, a different portrayal in words, or is it the same problems, or is that something different?
I think it depends on how you do it. And I realize that that's kind of a nothing response, but I think it would depend on if you were like wholesale taking this, or if you are taking something that looks kind of like this and describing it that way, and describing it differently. It would depend on if you're alluding it to be different. I would say that if you take something that is noticeably reminiscent of this, that is clearly intended to be the, Hindi Rakshasa, and then you made it something different, I think that that could run into similar issues, yeah.
I feel like, right now we're in this weird stage where there's a lot of sort of smell test about what's okay. Like, I can go to a movie and see somebody put on a Scottish accent, and that's not offensive, but if they put on an Indian accent, it is. And you're like, well, what if I was in England, or what if it was an Irish accent from an Englishman, and now that is offensive? And so I feel like a lot of it, I think that the designers of D&D would be sort of weighing essentially the Orientalist style and that tradition versus the original. And were I to do it, I'd probably put a note in and say, this is what we always did in D&D. If you have an old module you're adapting, this is what you do. If you just want like the concept of this, a demon anyhow, take a demon. And frankly, I would just remove the word Rakshasa anyhow as as the name of an entity, an entity that people believe in. You know what I mean? That's a living, active religion that you're sort of trivializing. The Wizard of the Coast wouldn't put Jesus into their monster manual, and it's really, or Satan, and it's the exact same sort of thing. It's really like, it's still inappropriate no matter what. So, I feel like at least a footnote might be.
Yeah. Yes.
I think we're reaching a point now with a lot of content where we are beginning to generate this content less from a human brain and more from a generative or procedural algorithm. Unfortunately, that builds a lot more on top of the content that already exists. Are you looking at safeguards or processes or procedures for influencing the system or the AI by which one of this content is generated to prevent this orientalism from happening? Or do you think it's the responsibility of the people using those tools to do that pass in order to make sure they're not continuing this kind of content?
I think it's both. I think here I'm speaking to game designers. The centerpiece is how do you make sure that your game doesn't do something like this, right? And that is you be aware in context. As for AI, there's a lot of safeguards that need to be put up around AI. This is one of them. There's a lot of research about the way that AI treats people of color differently, it treats women differently. This is a part of that, but it's also, and because of that, it's not something you would address, I think, on its own. It's something you address as part of a really big overhaul.